Prologue. I know of a great nation who once shone as bright as the noonday sun. Regrettably, they have forgotten who they are. How it pains me that they do not remember. However, I have not given up hope, because I know there is a calling on their lives, and it will come to pass. In fact, it has been prophesied that they will shine again. Let there be no mistake. This nation of whom I speak is no ordinary one. You see, their kingdom is not of this world, but of another. It is very beautiful there, and they have the most amazing king there ever was. Nothing that I have ever seen here can even compare to it. Unfortunately, their bliss was not to last. Sadly, they were caught in the throes of an ageless struggle coming to head, and were thrown from their world into a foreign land. It is still hard for me to believe, but one of their very own chief princes turned against the king. His betrayal, you might well imagine, rocked the kingdom to its core, but their king stood strong. He had known all along what was going to happen and had prepared for such a battle. He knew only too well that his enemy was conspiring against him. Darkness is a most formidable foe. But the king had had enough. He had thought long and hard about it and had come up with the perfect solution. He would create an arena in another dimension, a place where the war would at long last be played out, a place where he would conquer his enemy once and for all. He would call it time. How did he do this, you ask? He enlarged the kingdom and divided it into two, in much the same way as a cell multiplies, thus creating a twin kingdom. At first, his enemy had thought he had won, for the king was nowhere to be found. But soon he realized he had suffered a great blow. He was furious once he realized what had really happened. Somehow, the king, in one sure move, had changed things forever. Alas, the victory was not complete. The king's enemy, his betrayal, did manage to do one very important thing. It had opened the gate for darkness to bewitch the minds and infect the hearts of the people. Let no one fool you. Betrayal is no small thing. The king was left with no choice but to exile his beloved people too. It was the hardest thing he ever had to do. The king has not abandoned them, though, but has prepared a way for them to return. However, only those who overcome the curse can use it. I'd like to say it's easy, but it's not. The way is narrow, and our enemy is ruthless. But for those of us who do find it, a crown of gold and everlasting life is granted. If you listen carefully, you will be able to hear the king calling out across the chasm of time to come to him. His enemy tries every trick he knows to obscure the king's voice, but it's everywhere. There's no getting away from it. It's in the rustling of the leaves, in the kind voice of a stranger, and even painted in the sunset. Nothing can silence it. Indeed, there is nothing his enemy hates more. Tom, I know that times are hard and confusing. The world is in much chaos, and life often seems pointless, even with all of today's technology. I know, too, that this story may turn out to be just another story to you, But it is my sincere desire that it will help you to see that there is still hope, even in such dark days, and that you can find it, no matter what is going on around you. I've been thinking maybe, just maybe, this is exactly what you need. A story with a happy ending. Anyway, I hope you like it. It's filled with all kinds of characters, mainly ordinary old types with extraordinary destinies. Who knows? Perhaps somewhere along the way, you might even recognize yourself. Where is the best place to begin my tale? There is but one place, really, and that is with Tom. Tom lived at the palace when the kingdom was attacked. His dad, Jack, worked for the king. Tom was a born leader. You know the type. He was average in height with dark brown hair and blue eyes. The only thing you might find a bit unusual about him was the length of his hair. He'd never cut it, not even once. But that was normal where he lived. Many of his friends had long hair. He rarely wore it loose, though, but always tied back at the nape of his neck and in a long braid that hung down the center of his back, between his shoulders. Tom loved adventure. The thrill of mastering new things, running, wrestling, and of course, outside. But there was a lot more to him than met the eye. He was, you might say, in tune. He noticed everything, from the smallest dewdrop to the cosmos of the heavens. Nothing escaped him. Incidentally, this did not go unnoticed by the king. In fact, the king was searching for such a lad. And Tom? Well, there was nothing he wouldn't do for him. As far as Tom was concerned, he was the best king there ever was. He planned on following in his dad's footsteps. He wanted to work for the king. What's more, he didn't just want to work for the king, but he wanted to work closely with him. He figured there was much he could learn. The attack. I remember it well. At first there was nothing out of the ordinary. Tom was playing kickball when, seemingly from out of nowhere, a ferocious storm descended. It stopped him dead in his tracks. Indeed, where Tom lived, tempests were unheard of altogether. "What's going on?" he shouted. Tom could barely hear himself above the howling wind. It had swallowed up his voice. As he stared out across the green field, it didn't take much to figure out that nobody else had heard him either. Tom couldn't believe his eyes. The trees were swaying back and forth, and some of the low-lying brush was getting ripped right out of the ground. The sky was darkening too, and then an intense light zigzagged right in front of him, followed by a loud rumbling. Apparently, whatever was going on was growing. "Aye, what's that?" he cringed. He lifted his arm to block another strike, but it didn't help. A blast of ice-cold air struck him hard across the face. Tobias and Emily, his brother and sister, were standing about 100 meters away to his right. They were huddled together, trying to protect themselves from the raging wind. He scanned around for his other sister, Sarah. Sarah came running up behind him. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" she yelled anxiously. Her cheeks were stinging from the cold wind, and her golden hair danced about madly. "No, never," he answered, baffled. The two of them exchanged a concerned look. Tom hurriedly grabbed her arm. "Let's go get Tobias and Emily," he urged. The wind tore at his eyes. Their eyes watered so much it made it impossible to see clearly. Everything looked distorted and blurry. They bowed their heads down to shield their faces and then headed towards Emily and Tobias. It was a fight, but they finally reached them. Emily's face was stark white. "What's the matter with you?" gasped Tom. She was eerie to look at. The contrast of her long, dark hair swirling around her nearly translucent white face was surreal. Her emerald green eyes stood out more than ever. Tom wondered if he looked as strange as she did. It was said more than once that they looked a lot alike. They both had their dad's dark brown hair and contagious smile. Tobias and Sarah looked more like their mother, who was blonde with blue eyes. "Something extraordinary is happening," Emily finally managed to shout. It took nearly everything out of her. Tom looked over at Tobias. He didn't look much better off than Emily. His lips were blue and he was shivering. Tobias stared at him, their eyes locked. They both knew Emily was right. Emily looked as if she were about to drop. Tom quickly let go of Sarah's arm and rushed to help. They were all in such a state of shock that they didn't know what had hit them. They'd never seen the weather act this way. But it was more than that. There was also an overwhelming sense of dread clinging to them. Tom braced himself. He knew there was much more going on than the change in the sky. Something was happening inside of them as well. Emily was handling it the worst overall. She had nearly tumbled to the ground altogether. They were literally dumbfounded. "Excuse me, Tobias," yelled Sarah as politely as she could as she squeezed herself next to Emily. She needed to get next to her. They were more than sisters, they were best friends. Tobias switched spots with Sarah and then linked arms with her and Tom to form a protective circle around Emily. The wind was not abating one bit and swirled around them intoxicatingly. Their clothes billowed and the girls' dresses rose up and down like ocean waves with each new gust. Sarah wanted to ask Emily what had happened, but she was well aware that her big sister didn't know any more than she did. "Let's get inside," shouted Sarah, signaling towards the palace. Tom nodded and then craned his neck back to have a quick look around. He squinted. The wind ripped at his eyes. Everyone was more or less in different stages of making their way back to the palace, except for 5 or 6 little ones not too far behind them who obviously needed help. Tom looked at Sarah and Tobias and then finally at Emily. "I've got to go help," he said reluctantly, breaking free from their circle. It was the first time in his life he felt like he needed to be in 2 places at once. It was the strangest feeling he had ever had. Tobias scrambled to grab Emily's free arm. "Oh no," thought Sarah. The little ones had all at once collapsed on top of one another, and by the looks of it, their little cousin, Ailette, was at the very bottom of the heap. "Watch out for baby," thought Sarah. Ailette wasn't exactly a baby anymore. She could walk and was even saying a few words, but she was the littlest one in their clan. Everyone still called her baby. Sarah desperately wanted to run to her, but of course that was out of the question. Emily was like a dead weight on her shoulder. She couldn't possibly. Thankfully, Tom had gone, but he needed help. The wind tore at the little ones mercilessly and threw their hair and clothes about furiously. In some cases, it was hard to tell which end was up. "We have to help Tom," yelled Sarah. Tobias and Emily were thinking the same thing. They needed to get over there. Bit by bit, the 3 of them inched their way towards him. Emily tried as hard as she could to bear her own weight, but her legs were not cooperating at all. It was very frustrating, to say the least. After many attempts, Tom finally succeeded in getting the little ones back on their feet again. He had managed to prop them up side by side around his legs. He tried his best to protect them from the wind, but how was he ever going to get them to the palace? Phew. As soon as Baby saw Sarah drawing near, she ran straight to her. Sarah was relieved to have her close, but she was seriously affected. She was not herself at all. Actually, the same thing had touched all the little ones. Their lips were trembling and their mouths were contorted upside down, and the loudest, most unusual noises were coming out of their mouths. It was the strangest thing Sarah had ever seen or heard. They reminded her of baby birds or something of the sort, but that was pure silliness. What was she thinking? It was the closest thing she could come to making any sense of what was happening. Whatever the case, she was sure none of it was at all natural. Slowly but surely, they moved across the field toward the palace. They looked more like a drifting enigma rather than humans, with their hulking shape contrasting the brilliant green expanse, and the girls' hair flaring and their clothes billowing in the wind. The air was thick the whole way. It was almost like they were moving through some sort of invisible sludge. Everything felt heavy.